Act 1. The Roots of Resentment and Rise to Power, 1918 to 1933. The Shattered Peace, 1918 to 1929. The story of Nazi Germany is fundamentally rooted in the ashes of a previous conflict. The defeat of the German Empire in November 1918 brought an end to World War I, ushering in the Weimar Republic, a fragile democratic experiment in a nation traumatized by loss and humiliation. The single most potent factor fueling post-war German resentment was a Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919. This treaty stripped Germany of significant territory, imposed crushing war reparations of £6.6 billion, and severely restricted the size of its army and navy. For many Germans, the treaty was a diktat, a dictated peace, which they believed was signed by the Weimar politicians, who became known as the November Criminals. This pervasive feeling of betrayal and national emasculation became the psychological bedrock upon which radical political movements would build their platforms. Among these extremist groups was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler. The Nazi ideology was ultra-nationalist, anti-democratic, and violently anti-Semitic, blending a fervent desire for a greater, purer German Reich with the rejection of communism and the democratic system. In the early 1920s, the Weimar Republic endured years of instability, including hyperinflation, economic chaos, and political extremism from both the far left and far right. In this environment of civil unrest, Hitler attempted to seize power by force with the Beer Hall Putsch in November 1923. The coup failed, leading to Hitler's arrest, but it was a crucial turning point. During his imprisonment, he wrote Mein Kampf, laying out his extremist program for the future: territorial expansion, Lebensraum, racial cleansing, and the destruction of the parliamentary system. Upon his release, Hitler shifted strategy. Recognizing that force was premature, he chose the path of legality, resolving to undermine democracy from within by exploiting its own electoral laws. The mid-1920s saw a brief period of economic recovery, the so-called Golden Twenties, which marginalized the extremist message of the Nazis. The party remained a small fringe movement, attracting less than 3% of the national vote in 1928. The Great Depression and the electoral path. The economic boom ended abruptly with the Wall Street crash in 1929. The ensuing Great Depression shattered the fragile German economy, leading to mass bankruptcies and soaring unemployment that peaked at 6 million jobless by 1932. This economic catastrophe was the political oxygen the Nazis needed. Hitler positioned the Nazi Party as the only force capable of restoring order and national pride. Their messaging was brutally simple. The Weimar democracy was ineffective. The communists were a threat, and only a powerful, centralized, authoritarian state could deliver jobs and national renewal. The use of massive, highly organized rallies, modern propaganda techniques orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels, and the visible intimidation of the SA, stormtroopers, created a sense of dynamic, unstoppable momentum. In the 1930 and July 1932 elections, the Nazi voter share skyrocketed, transforming the party from a fringe group to the largest voting bloc in the Reichstag. Despite the success, the Nazis never achieved an outright majority. However, the political elite, under the aging president Paul von Hindenburg, underestimated Hitler. A cabal of conservative politicians, believing they could control and co-opt him to form a stable right-wing government, convinced Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as Chancellor of Germany on January 30, 1933. The seizure of power, Machtgriffen, was achieved not by revolution, but by a series of backroom political maneuvers within the democratic framework the Nazis sought to destroy. Act 2. Consolidating Control and Aggression, 1933 to 1939. From Chancellor to Führer, establishing the totalitarian state. Once in power, Hitler moved with speed and ruthlessness to dismantle the foundations of German democracy. The first critical step was a Reichstag fire in February 1933. Blaming a Dutch communist for the arson, Hitler persuaded Hindenburg to pass the Reichstag fire decree, which effectively suspended all constitutional civil liberties, freedom of speech, assembly, and the press under the pretense of national emergency. This decree became the legal foundation for a political terror campaign, allowing for the arbitrary arrests and imprisonment of thousands of communist and socialist opponents. The final fatal blow to democracy was the passing of the Enabling Act on March 23, 1933. This act allowed Hitler's cabinet to pass laws without the consent of the Reichstag or the president, making him a legal dictator. With political opposition neutralized or imprisoned, the Nazi Party was declared the only legal political party in July 1933. The next challenge to Hitler's authority came from within his own party, the massive paramilitary SA, led by Ernst Röhm, which was calling for a second revolution. To consolidate his power with the conservative German army, Reichswehr, Hitler ordered a brutal purge in June 1934, known as the Night of the Long Knives. Röhm and hundreds of other SA leaders and political opponents were murdered by the SS, the Schutzstaffel. This act signaled that the new regime was prepared to use extreme violence against anyone, even its own. The death of President Hindenburg in August 1934 finalized the transition. Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President, proclaiming himself Führer, leader, and sole head of the Reich. Germany was now a totalitarian dictatorship, centralized under Hitler's personal authority, with the SS, led by Heinrich Himmler, taking over control of the internal police state. Rearmament and racial ideology. With internal control cemented, the Nazi regime turned its full attention to foreign policy and ideological goals. The central driving forces were the rejection of the Treaty of Versailles and the pursuit of racial purity. Rearmament was the key strategic policy of the 1930s. Hitler formally withdrew Germany from the League of Nations in 1933, and in 1935 openly reintroduced compulsory military conscription, expanding the army, Wehrmacht, and establishing the Luftwaffe Air Force, all in direct violation of Versailles. This massive spending, combined with public works projects like the Autobahnen, helped alleviate mass unemployment, bolstering domestic support for the regime. The secret rearmament program transformed Germany into a war state, financed largely through deficit spending.
Racism and anti-Semitism were not secondary features, but the very core of Nazi policy. The Nuremberg race laws of 1935 institutionalized the regime's racial vision, revoking the German citizenship of Jews and prohibiting marriage or sexual relations between Jews and Aryans. This legislation marked the formal legal segregation of German Jewry, transforming them from citizens into outcasts. This legal persecution was punctuated by acts of terror, such as the Kristallnacht, Night of Broken Glass, pogrom in November 1938, where coordinated violence against Jewish people and property was carried out across Germany and Austria. The road to war, strategic aggression in the East. His strategy was based on two calculated assumptions: the West's fear of another major war and the weakness of the existing international system. 1. Remilitarization of the Rhineland, March 1936. Hitler sent troops into the demilitarized Rhineland. This was a massive gamble. Had France or Britain intervened, the small German force would have been forced to withdraw. Their failure to act convinced Hitler that the Western powers lacked the will to enforce the Treaty of Versailles. The Anschluss, March 1938. Using the pretext of unifying all German-speaking people, German troops annexed Austria. The lack of any significant international opposition confirmed Hitler's belief that rapid, decisive actions could present the world with a fait accompli. The Sudetenland Crisis, September 1938. Hitler demanded the annexation of the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia, which contained a German-speaking minority. The international crisis culminated in the Munich Agreement, where British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French Premier Edward Daladier agreed to the annexation in exchange for Hitler's promise of no further territorial demands. Chamberlain famously declared he had achieved peace for our time. The agreement, the high point of the policy of appeasement was a catastrophic strategic blunder. It gave Germany a military advantage, the fortified Czech border, while signaling to Hitler that he could continue his aggressive policy unchecked. The invasion of Czechoslovakia, March 1939. Breaking his promise, Hitler seized the remainder of Czechoslovakia. This proved to the Western powers that Hitler's goals were limitless and not merely about self-determination. The policy of appeasement was over. The Nazi-Soviet Pact, August 1939. In a stunning diplomatic move, Germany signed a non-aggression pact with its ideological nemesis, the Soviet Union. The pact secretly divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence, guaranteeing that Germany could invade Poland without fear of a two-front war. With this strategic flank secured, the final piece of the war plan was in place. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France, finally forced to honor their treaty obligations, declared war. World War II had begun. Act 3. Global War and Peak Power, 1939 to 1942. The strategy of Blitzkrieg. In the initial years of World War II, German military strategy achieved a level of success that appeared almost supernatural. This success was built on Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, a revolutionary method of offensive warfare. Blitzkrieg was designed to avoid the static, attritional trench warfare of World War I. It relied on a highly coordinated, combined arms approach. Speed, focused, overwhelming force from motorized infantry and highly mobile panzer or tank divisions. Air superiority from the close air support of the Luftwaffe to soften defenses, destroy communications, and induce terror. Radio communication, crucial for allowing junior field commanders to maintain momentum and exploit breakthroughs without waiting for lengthy orders from headquarters. The goal was not to occupy, but to break through, bypass strong points, and strike deep into the enemy's rear areas, to paralyze their command and control and force the enemy to surrender before they could organize a static defense or mobilize industrial production. This strategy brought a series of spectacular and rapid victories. Poland, September 1939, conquered in less than 5 weeks. Denmark and Norway, April 1940, secured the northern flank and access to essential iron ore supplies. The West, May, June 1940. In perhaps its most brilliant execution, the Wehrmacht bypassed the heavily fortified Maginot Line by striking through the dense Ardennes forest, encircling the main French and British forces concentrated in Belgium. In just 6 weeks, France surrendered. By the summer of 1940, Hitler controlled Western Europe from the Atlantic to the Polish border. The United Kingdom, led by Churchill, stood alone. The strategy of invading Britain, Operation Sea Lion, failed after the Luftwaffe lost the Battle of Britain, the first major German defeat due to the resilience of the RAF and the strategic use of radar. Ideology unleashed. Operation Barbarossa. Having failed to defeat Britain, Hitler turned his attention to the east to pursue the core ideological goal of Lebensraum, the conquest of the Soviet Union. This invasion, Operation Barbarossa, which launched on June 22, 1941, was not a conventional war of conquest, but a war of annihilation. The goal was the military defeat of the Soviet state, the extermination of the political and ideological elite, and the physical eradication of the Slavic population to clear the land for German farmer soldiers. This invasion was initially stunningly successful, with German armies advancing hundreds of miles and capturing millions of Soviet soldiers in vast encirclement battles. German forces pushed deep into Soviet territory, reaching the gates of Leningrad, Kyiv, and most crucially, Moscow. However, the war in the East quickly exposed the fundamental strategic flaws of the Nazi regime.
Underestimation of the enemy. Hitler gravely underestimated the Soviet Union's vast industrial capacity, its ability to move war production far beyond the reach of the Luftwaffe east of the Ural Mountains, and the sheer depth of its manpower reserves. Logistical overextension. The German army's supply lines became impossibly long. The vast distances, combined with a lack of adequate infrastructure and the onset of the brutal Russian winter for which the Wehrmacht was wholly unprepared, crippled the advance. German forces stalled just miles from Moscow in December 1941. Fueling the resistance, the extreme brutality of the German occupation, characterized by the Hunger Plan and the wholesale murder of civilians and Soviet prisoners of war, galvanized the Soviet people into a patriotic struggle known as the Great Patriotic War, which provided the regime of Joseph Stalin with the mass support it needed to resist. By the end of 1941, the German advance had ground to a halt. The United States' entry into the war following the attack on Pearl Harbor fundamentally shifted the balance of industrial and human power against Germany. Germany had successfully provoked a two-front war, a strategic nightmare it had desperately sought to avoid in WW1. Act 4. The Crushing Defeat and Collapse, 1942 to 1945. The Strategic Turning Points, 1942 to 1943. The year 1942 marks the peak of Nazi Germany's territorial control, but also the point where the strategic initiative definitively shifted to the Allies. The German war machine, now fighting on a massive scale from the Atlantic to the Volga River and the deserts of North Africa, began to crack under the strain of a global attritional conflict, one Stantafa now fighting on multiple fronts, each requiring immense logistical support. 1. Stalingrad, August 1942 to February 1943. This battle, fought for control of the city named for the Soviet leader and for access to the vital oil fields of the Caucasus, became a monumental, brutal meat grinder. Driven by Hitler's insistence on no surrender, the German Sixth Army was completely encircled and ultimately annihilated. The loss of nearly 300,000 elite troops was an irreparable human and psychological blow. Stalingrad marked the definitive turning point on the Eastern Front. From this point forward, the Soviet Red Army held this strategic initiative, relentlessly pushing the Wehrmacht westwards. 2. North Africa, October 1942 to May 1943. The British victory at El Alamein in October 1942, followed by the Anglo-American Operation Torch, landings trapped and defeated German and Italian forces in Tunisia. The Mediterranean was secured for the Allies, opening the path for the invasion of Italy. 3. The Allied bombing campaign. From 1942 onward, the Royal Air Force, RAF, and the United States Army Air Force, USAAF, intensified their strategic bombing campaign against German cities and industrial centers. This campaign systematically destroyed German infrastructure, crippled war production, and decimated civilian morale. Though controversial in its targeting of civilians, the campaign forced Germany to divert massive resources, anti-aircraft guns, fighters, and manpower from the battlefronts to air defense. These defeats collectively shifted the war from a phase of German offense to a desperate two-front defense. The long war of attrition, the type of war Blitzkrieg was explicitly designed to prevent, had arrived, and the overwhelming industrial capacity of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union now made German defeat a mathematical certainty. The collapse of the empire, 1944 to 1945. By 1944, the tide of war was irreversible. The Eastern Steamroller, the Soviet Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944, was the most devastating single defeat in German military history, smashing Army Group Center and driving German forces completely out of Soviet territory and deep into Poland. The Red Army was marching toward the German heartland. The Western Front, D-Day. On June 6, 1944, the Western Allies successfully landed in Normandy, France, Operation Overlord, opening the long-awaited Second Front. Despite fierce German resistance, the Allies broke out and swept across France, liberating Paris in August 1944. Hitler's denial and final gambles. Faced with catastrophic setbacks, Hitler's strategic decision-making became increasingly erratic. He removed competent generals and took direct personal command, insisting on fanatical, often suicidal stands rather than tactical retreats. The last major German counter-offensive, the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, was an attempt to split the Western Allied armies. It failed completely, exhausting Germany's last strategic reserves of men and material. The final year of the war saw the physical destruction of Germany.
Hitler, retreating to his Führer bunker beneath Berlin, became increasingly divorced from reality, issuing orders for armies that no longer existed. The infrastructure of the totalitarian state, sustained by terror and ideology, only held together through the final brutal months due to the efficiency of the SS and the terror of summary executions for defeatism. The finality of defeat. In April 1945, the Soviet Red Army encircled and began its final, brutal assault on Berlin. The city became the site of apocalyptic street-to-street fighting. As the Soviets closed in on the bunker, Adolf Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 1945, unwilling to face the consequences of his ambition and the destruction he had wrought. He was succeeded briefly by Admiral Karl Donitz. The war in Europe officially ended a week later. On May 7th, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Western Allies at Reims. A subsequent unconditional surrender was signed in Berlin on May 8th, 1945, formally ending the war in Europe. The Third Reich, which Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years, had collapsed after just 12 years and 4 months, leaving behind a continent devastated by the worst conflict in human history. The rise and fall of Nazi Germany serves as a chilling case study in how a combination of economic desperation, sophisticated propaganda, a charismatic leader, and the strategic failure of international powers can allow an extremist ideology to capture a modern state, transform it into a total war machine, and lead a global conflict that resulted in the deaths of tens of millions worldwide, exposing the full extent of human brutality in the pursuit of ideological, strategic, and racial dominance. The strategy, power, and collapse of this global threat forever redefined the nature of modern warfare and the moral boundaries of political action.